What's the creepiest urban legend you've ever heard? Story 1. In the Northeast U.S., there's a story about the woods people, or man-o-woods. When you're driving along a road in the woods and catch a glimpse of what looks like a person in the corner of your eye, but when you look directly at it, it's gone, they say you might have encountered a man-o-woods. They are masters of camouflage and can sense when someone is looking at them. They come to a halt so you can't detect any movement. It's speculated that they wear bark, mud, moss, and grasses to blend in. They're supposedly human, but extremely simple-minded, barely verbal. They're very small in stature and mostly avoid contact with civilization. Nobody knows where they live or gather, but they usually move on if there's too much activity around. They're also peaceful. Around some farmlands, they will do very simple chores at night or off in the distance. They may sweep a barn floor or stack some wood, but anything more complex is beyond them. They do it in exchange for being left alone while they sleep in the barn for a night, or for some bread and vegetables left out for them to find. They've never been known to steal or harm animals or livestock. Story 2. So, I had a football coach back in high school who was also one of my teachers for a semester. He told us one story that freaked us all out pretty badly. He had a coaching job at a small college in Montana when he was much younger and newly married. He said that after practice one evening, he was making his long commute home, and the route ran alongside fields of hay, grain, or something similar. Since it was late summer or early fall, it wasn't even close to dark yet. His car was an old beat-up truck with just a bench seat. Anyway, he's driving along when he sees a hitchhiker on the shoulder. This being back in the day and in small-town Montana, my teacher pulled over to let the guy in without a second thought. The man was described as wearing a really old, outdated style of suit, not quite a zoot suit, but styled similarly with a baggy cut. He also had a big, stylish hat. This guy looked like he was from the 1940s and sort of like a pimp. My teacher thought it was odd that he was so overdressed, considering how hot it was out. But maybe that was the only clothing he had. So, the guy gets in next to my teacher without a word. The teacher asks him where he needs to go, and the guy just points forward. The teacher drives on. Later, he tries making small talk, but the man won't respond or even acknowledge him. He just pulls his hat down like he's sleeping. Out of nowhere, the guy tips up his hat, looks out the window and says, "Stop the car now." My teacher pulls over and lets him out, not wanting to upset a possibly unstable person. The guy stands on the side of the road for a moment, then, in a dead sprint, runs off into the field beside the road until my teacher can't see him anymore. The crop was fairly tall. He waits there a while, thinking maybe the guy had to relieve himself and didn't want to do it near the road. After waiting long enough, my teacher gets back in the truck and begins accelerating. The thing about really old trucks is that they don't accelerate very fast. As he gets back onto the road, he looks in his rearview mirror to check for a safe merge. There aren't any cars in sight. But what he does see is the hitchhiker, on all fours like an animal, running, maybe crawling, after the truck at an inhuman speed. Meanwhile, the truck begins to fishtail as he tries to speed up. His eyes stay glued to the mirror, watching the man chase after his vehicle. Eventually, he gets up to speed and loses sight of the guy. When he finally stops at a gas station to use a payphone, he calls his wife to tell her the story and to lock up the house. She thinks he's just messing with her, especially since a co-worker of hers had recently told the exact same story. Apparently, it's a well-known urban legend in that town. She thought people were just teasing the new girl at work who had to drive home alone at night. Anyway, my teacher swore he wasn't lying, and she believed him. She even came to one of our fundraisers, and when I asked her about it, she confirmed everything. So yeah, now I just avoid lonely roads in Montana. Story 3. We have one in Venezuela called El Silbón, the Whistler, typical of the wetland plains and prairie regions we call llanos. The description is usually of a very emaciated man dressed in cowboy, lanero, rags with a wide-brimmed hat that hides his skeletal face. He roams the countryside in bushes at night, with drooping shoulders, a downcast stare, and a heavy bag full of bones and half-decomposed remains slung over his back. There are two distinctive features that make him unique. He continuously whistles a high chord progression, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, that increases in pitch with each note, and he is unnaturally tall and strong, with some accounts describing him as towering over 6 meters in height. His origin is unclear, with some tales calling him an accursed parricide. But whatever he is feared by lone travelers, especially drunk or unfaithful men traveling through the countryside. The story goes that his ominous whistle is heard very loudly and nearby, but the source can't be pinpointed. And contrary to logic, when the sound gets softer and seems more distant, it actually means he is extremely close. He then kills by strangulation or blunt force and devours the victim, throwing the bones into his bag. He can occasionally be seen wading over the high walls of haciendas or farms. Honest prayer is said to keep him away. Story 4. I live in Northern Australia, and everyone who grows up in my town knows the legend of the Poinciana woman. A quick internet search will show the many variations of the story, but the version I grew up with is about a woman who was assaulted by Japanese fishermen. When she discovered she was pregnant, she hanged herself from a poinciana tree. She is said to appear as a beautiful woman to lure men. She has long dark hair and wears a white gown, and is believed to haunt our Army Reserve. When I was around 12 and my younger brother was 10, he had been in his room while I was in the lounge on the computer. He came barreling out of his room screaming, "Can you hear that? Can you hear that?" before dragging me over to the window. There was a faint feminine moan or hum. We could hear it moving from the window we stood at to the one across the room and back again in a clockwise direction. The wind picked up along with the sound, even though the night had been completely still. The sound became so loud that we ended up on the floor, covering our ears and crying. When I brought it up recently, my brother agreed. It was almost as if the sound had been inside our heads. This continued for about 10 minutes before it stopped abruptly. The wind disappeared. Everything was silent. Everything. We found out the next day that our older siblings had been at the Army Reserve the night before. They had climbed the concrete pillars to the locked gun turret and were taunting the Poinciana woman before leaving after hearing footsteps, assuming it was security. What creeps me out the most is that not long after this happened, I realized there was a poinciana tree right outside that window. Story 5. My mom told me this story about the village where she grew up in Scotland. The village's earliest known settlement dates back to 3000 BC, so it's ancient. It was once home to the Picts and the Romans. Nowadays, there's a small woodland, and the rest of the surrounding land is farmland. The woods used to be much larger. What remains is just a fraction of the large forest that once almost completely surrounded the village. Legend says the forest was home to witches. When the forest was being cleared to expand the farmland, a lone witch came out of the forest to tell the villagers to stop. She said the trees would not forgive humans for their destruction, and if the villagers did not heed her warning, all their land would become infertile, and so would all the women. Frightened, the villagers agreed but asked for a small portion of the forest. A deal was made that this, and only this, land could be cleared. The witch also said that for every harvest of every crop grown there, 1 sack of produce must be taken to the edge of the forest and left. This practice was followed for hundreds of years until the villagers abruptly tore down much of the remaining forest to grow wheat and build a mill. Again, a strange woman came from the forest into the village and threatened the villagers. She said they had broken the promise and would suffer. This time, the villagers captured the woman and hanged her. Her last words were that the price was now 3 sacks. The man who built the mill was frightened, and after the first harvest, he took 3 sacks into the woods. Unlike his neighbors, his crops did not fail, and his wife became pregnant. He always paid the woods their due, and before long, he was the richest man in the village and had 3 beautiful, healthy daughters. Unfortunately, the man grew greedy and decided he would no longer pay his 3 sacks. The next morning, his youngest daughter went missing. The entire village came to help search for her, but the man insisted his workers continue running the mill so he wouldn't lose money. Soon, there was a commotion at the mill. Some of the workers had fainted, others were crying, and some were shouting. The man came to see what was happening. A horrified worker told him they had started up the mill as usual, but blood had poured from between the stones. They had found his missing daughter. Distraught, the man sold his land and fled the village with his family. The mill was torn down, and years later, a silo was built on the same site. By the 1960s, the silo was ancient and crumbling. It was rumored to be haunted, either by the farmer, his daughter, or the witch, sometimes all 3. This part is my mom's story. One day, she and her friends made a bet to see who could spend a night in the silo. One boy, who was always bragging about his bravery, volunteered. Between them, my mom and her friends conspired to keep this a secret from their parents by lying about camping in each other's gardens. That evening, the boy, John, climbed to the silo loft, and Mum and her friend gave him a bag of food, a blanket, and a torch. They told him they'd be back in the morning, but they were actually planning to return later to scare him. They waited a few hours and snuck back to the silo, but alarmingly, they could hear John sobbing and crying for help. They found him quite a distance from the silo, dragging himself along on his stomach. John had jumped from the silo loft and broken his ankles. He was carried back to his parents' house and taken to the hospital. After the inevitable week of punishment, my mum was allowed to visit John. She said he still looked as terrified then as he had that night. She asked him what had happened. He told his parents and the doctors that he fell, but the truth was he saw something. Not long after being left alone, he heard something shuffling around in the loft. He used the torch to look, but saw only empty grain bags. He tried to ignore the noise, but eventually it sounded like it was moving toward him. When he shone the torch on the grain bags again, he saw they were crawling, dragging themselves along the floor toward him. That's why he jumped. Story 6. My grandfather and his 4 brothers spent their summers at their family's bay house, more of a shack, really, in Fairhope, Alabama when they were young. It was about a 5-minute walk to Mobile Bay, and having grown up around there myself, I can personally attest to the area's long history of spooky stuff. One night, my grandfather and his brothers were sleeping on the house's screened-in front porch, since air conditioning wasn't readily available, and it was South Alabama in the middle of summer. They were fast asleep in the middle of the night when an old taxi drove up and parked in front of the house. A man and a woman got out of the cab dressed in worn-out wedding attire, top hat, tails and all. They walked up to the house, and the woman scratched the wood siding of the screened-in door with long fingernails. Then the pair returned to the cab and drove off. All the boys were awakened by the sound of the scratching, but they were too scared to move or make a sound until morning. The next day, my grandfather brought it up to his brothers, and they all confirmed it had actually happened. It wasn't a dream. They began calling the woman the witch and claimed to have seen or heard her multiple times throughout their lives. A few years ago, I went to see the house before it was torn down. On the wooden panel near the front door, there were 5 scratches spaced in the exact way fingernails would leave marks. I told the current owner the story, and he became visibly disturbed. He told me that an old taxi would occasionally park across the street around midnight and stay there until just before daybreak. Still gives me the heebie-jeebies. Story 7. Clownman. I lived just outside Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, as a teenager, in a small, poor town called Swissvale. The neighboring communities were Rankin and Braddock, once thriving steel towns now plagued by poverty. A strip of woods lined by train tracks runs along the river where our communities sit. Right next to the river looms the decrepit, abandoned steel mill once known as Carey Furnace. Like many teens, my friends and I used to cut through the park, cross the tracks, and hang out by the river, drinking, smoking, and just killing time. Eventually, we began exploring the steel mill. I loved it. The graffiti and sculptural art, the wildlife that had moved in, even the homeless people who called it home, it all made it feel like an adventure. I became comfortable there. Then my friends told me a story. They said a teenager had once been abducted and assaulted, and her naked, bloodied body was found strung up on a set of city steps. The killer, they said, was a deranged man who dressed as a clown, wearing a horrifying blood-stained mask. He lives in the woods and in the steel mill. He walks the tracks with a butcher knife he never cleans. Don't come here alone, as they warned. One night, after a fight with my boyfriend, I stubbornly decided to walk alone from the river, across the tracks and through the woods. When I got to the tracks, I turned and looked at the steel mill. Further down the tracks, I saw a figure. I couldn't see the face, but the baggy pants looked clown-like. I ran like I've never run before. I've never felt fear like that. It was probably just a homeless man. But who takes chances with a legend like that? Story 8. This isn't so much an urban legend as a ghost story, but it always freaked me out as a kid. My mom used to be friends with a woman who was kind of a drug user. She had 2 kids, Brian and Sarah. Sarah was really sweet and cute. She was in 9th grade when I was in 2nd. Anyway, Sarah's mom was into drugs and her dad was an alcoholic. But other than the drinking, he was a good guy and took excellent care of both kids. The mom and dad divorced in the early 2000s. Sarah stayed with her dad, and Brian went with the mom. The dad started dating someone new soon after the divorce, and Sarah was old enough that she also had a boyfriend. She was probably 17 or 18 when this story happened. Where I live, it can get extremely foggy at night during certain seasons. One evening, the dad, his girlfriend Sarah, and her boyfriend went out for dinner and a movie. They went to Applebee's and the dad and his girlfriend had a few drinks. Not enough to call a cab, though. It's a rural area, and people know the back roads. Long story short, the dad took a turn too quickly and crashed the car into a tree. Sarah was dazed but conscious after the impact. She managed to get out, despite a badly cut arm and leg. She said her dad and her boyfriend also got out of the car, while the dad's girlfriend was already dead in the front seat. Her dad told Sarah and her boyfriend to go get help while he stayed behind to try to help his girlfriend. Sarah said that she and her boyfriend climbed up the embankment to the road and ran half a mile or so to the nearest house. The police later confirmed this by following Sarah's blood trail. She said she kept collapsing, getting tired from the blood loss, but her boyfriend kept helping her up and telling her to stay awake. Eventually, she made it to a house and knocked on the door. The residents called 911, and the paramedics arrived just in time to stop her from bleeding out. Sarah kept begging them to go help her dad and boyfriend. The medics told her they would, but they needed her to describe where the accident had occurred. She did, of course. But here's the thing. Her dad, his girlfriend, and her boyfriend had all died instantly when the car hit the tree. Her boyfriend had a broken neck, and the others were crushed in the front seat. When the first responders arrived, all three were still strapped in their seats, dead on arrival. I haven't spoken to Sarah in over 10 years, but back when I did, she still believed that her boyfriend's ghost had saved her. Story 9. There's a local legend about a campsite I used to visit here in upstate New York. The story goes that a man called the H-Man lives in the woods near the site. Years ago, a group of Boy Scouts camped there, and one of the boys went missing. They didn't find him until they were packing up to leave. As they were cleaning and collecting their belongings, they discovered the boy, dead under one of the mattresses with an H carved into his chest. The legend says that when the H-Man kills campers, he carves an H into their chest. Growing up, all of us kids who camped there were terrified of him. We were told that if you hiked far enough into the woods, you could find his house. Well, there is an abandoned house deep in the woods. We found it once. I was terrified. The creepy part was that there were no roads or paths leading to it. It was just a lone, abandoned house sitting in the middle of nowhere. If you ever go camping in Minerva, New York, keep an eye out for the H-Man. Storytime. One of my friends told me this a long time ago. She heard it from someone else, of course. A group of high school friends made a bet involving a local haunted house. One of the guys said he could spend the entire night inside without leaving. His friends agreed but insisted he be tied to the upstairs banister with a rope, just to make sure he didn't try to sneak out. He agreed. They tied him up and left. The next morning they returned to get him. He seemed a little dazed but said everything was fine. He won the bet and collected. Life went on. The friends graduated, went off to college. Everyone except the haunted house guy. He stayed in town, hopping between dead-end jobs and growing more reclusive over time. Eventually they all lost touch with him. Then came the news. He had taken his own life. Everyone was shocked. But what horrified them most was learning that he had used the same rope they tied him with that night in the haunted house. Story 11. This might get buried, but it's worth telling. Buckle up. Back in college, one of my friends lived about 20 to 25 minutes outside of town, halfway between our college town and a smaller nearby town. One Sunday night around 10 p.m., they heard an unexpected knock at the door. One of the guys checked the peephole and saw a woman. Something felt immediately off, so he grabbed his gun before answering. The woman was filthy and disheveled. She immediately pleaded to be let inside. Hesitantly, they allowed her in and asked why she was 10 miles from the nearest town, knocking on their door at night. Frantically, she claimed that people were chasing her because she had run away from a cult that had been systematically abusing children for decades. One of the guys didn't believe her until she pulled out a stack of disturbing Polaroids. Each one showed a different child posed in front of a bookcase, almost like a mugshot. She insisted the cops were in on it and begged them not to call anyone. She said she just needed a ride to the bus station where she could meet an attorney she had been in contact with. She didn't want money, just a ride and silence. For whatever reason, my friends agreed. One of them gave her his number and asked her to update him later. They dropped her off at the Greyhound station and returned home. But almost immediately, paranoia set in. They decided to call the police. A couple of sheriffs and officers from the neighboring towns showed up. They asked questions: what the woman looked like, where she went, what she said. My friends lied. They said they had just dropped her off in a grocery store parking lot. No mention of the cult, the Polaroids, or the kids. The cops took their statements and left, but two officers from the smaller town came back later that night. They were much more aggressive, grilling the guys about every detail: what the woman said, where she was taken, why they helped her. When no one had anything else to offer, the officers left, but not before warning them to contact only them if anything like that ever happened again. They never heard from the woman again. The cops never returned, and nothing ever appeared in the news. Story 12. First of all, this is a story I was told by a former coworker, so I don't know for sure if it's just another creepypasta or if there's some truth to it, although the guy claimed to know the person the story's about. We live in a pretty rural area, and there was a nightclub that a lot of young people used to visit on weekends. Because the nearest big city was so far away, many of those visitors had to drive quite a while to get there. One night, a young woman wasn't feeling well and decided to drive home a bit earlier than her friends. She got into her car and began the drive home. Not far from the small town where the club was located, she noticed something standing on the road she was driving on. Since deer and other wild animals often cross the roads there, she slowed down and approached cautiously. To her surprise, it wasn't a deer, but a baby stroller standing in the middle of the road. She came to a stop and, against better judgment, decided to investigate. After all, what could really happen? She figured someone had just dumped it there. As she got closer to the stroller, she noticed headlights in the distance behind her, which oddly gave her a sense of safety, since she didn't feel completely alone in that moment. The stroller was empty, so she pushed it to the side of the road and got back into her car. Since she had seen the headlights of a car just moments earlier, she decided to let it pass before pulling back onto the road. The vehicle approached, but to her surprise, it didn't pass. It stopped right behind her. Both front doors opened almost immediately, which gave her a terrible feeling. So instead of waiting, she slammed on the gas and sped off. After a short while, she noticed the same car behind her. That uneasy feeling hadn't gone away, and now the vehicle was tailgating her and flashing its lights. Slowly, panic began to set in. She took a detour through the next village, making random turns, hoping to lose them. But the car stayed behind her, dangerously close, still flashing its lights. Unsure of what to do, she called her dad and explained the situation as best she could. He told her to head straight home as fast as possible. He'd leave the front door open and call the police. She got home, flung open the car door, and rushed inside, where her parents were already waiting. They locked the door and waited for the police to arrive. A few minutes later, the doorbell rang. But it wasn't the police, it was two young men who looked very concerned. They asked if the girl they had been following was all right. As it turns out, the two of them were also heading home from the club and had seen someone getting into her car while she was pushing the stroller out of the road. They followed her so that the person in the back seat couldn't do anything. After she stopped in front of the house, the man jumped out of the car and took off running. They tried to chase him down, but he got away. No one knows what might have happened if those two men hadn't been there. The road where this allegedly took place is in a remote area surrounded by woods. I don't remember reading anything about it in the news, which is strange considering the police were supposedly involved. I still get creeped out every time I drive down that same road, so I thought I'd share the story. Story 13. I live out in the woods, and there's a fairly large creek that runs about a half-mile south of my house. The land around here follows an east to west ridge beside the creek. Whenever the nearby fields are plowed, it's pretty easy to find arrowheads and spear points. I'm about 98% sure that, based on the number of arrowheads we've found, there are human remains somewhere on this property. Anyway, the actual legend says that a Native American toddler once wandered off and drowned in the creek, and the mother still roams the woods at night, screaming and crying for her baby. They eventually built a bridge over the creek, and it's been called Cry Baby Bridge for as long as my dad, who's 70, can remember. Now, I love ghost stories, and I've seen plenty of weird things after spending a lot of time out in the woods at night, but I'm not the type to believe in anything that can't be explained. We bought this house within minutes of it hitting the market. The previous owner had died by suicide 2 weeks earlier, somewhere in the front yard. One of my neighbors, who's a good friend, came over and told my wife about the local legend. He also said he had heard a woman screaming in a language he couldn't recognize, not English. Being in a brand new house, deep in the country, in dead silence, wintertime, with no curtains on the windows and a recent death on the property, made my wife extremely uneasy. Just across the holler, there's a man who owns some mules. One of them, I swear, has some kind of disorder. It makes the weirdest noises, day and night. Since we bought the house so suddenly, my wife had prior commitments she couldn't cancel. So I moved in first. She hadn't heard the mule yet. There are train tracks north of us, but they're far enough away that you can't hear the trains. However, coyotes will start howling long before a human can hear a train coming. If the coyotes near the tracks begin to howl, the ones closer to us will join in. All of these little details lined up one night. It was her first night sleeping in the house. The moon was full, there was fresh snow on the ground, and it was bright outside. We lay in bed staring out the window toward the woods where the creek runs. We were talking about unrelated ghost stories since she was already a little creeped out. Then a train must have gone by because suddenly every coyote in the county started howling. Being in the woods, we were completely surrounded. The coyotes must have set off the mule because it began making a racket. The coyotes eventually stopped, but the mule kept going. My wife had the most terrified expression I've ever seen. Apparently, the mule sounds a lot like a woman screaming in a foreign language, crying out for her lost baby. Story 14. I used to work as a graveyard shift valet at a casino on a reservation. At the top of the hill where we parked the cars, there was a massive dead tree that just stood there. At some point during the night, the moon would move behind it. When I was new, the more experienced valets would tell me that some kid had hung himself from that tree, and they first noticed it when the moon moved behind the branches and cast his silhouette. Of course, they followed up with the usual ghost storylines. You can still hear him weeping when the moon is behind the tree, and spot 156 is haunted. That's where he parked his car before it happened. It seemed like the usual tale told to scare the new hires. Later, they admitted it was just a story they made up to mess with people. One night, I was working and decided to tell that same story to a group of new guys. They wanted to go up to the tree to prove it wasn't haunted. We hiked up to the tree, and once we got there, we started hearing noises. The sounds were coming from inside the tree. Everyone stopped about 10 feet away, listening carefully and trying to figure it out. Then one guy, braver than the rest, used a walking stick he had picked up to tap the tree. The tree was decaying, so when he hit it, the stick broke a hole in the trunk. That's when we saw the source of the noise. A swarm of flying insects, cockroaches, burst out of the hole. A few centipedes came scurrying out, and we saw tarantulas and what looked like snakes too. Probably rattlesnakes, considering the area. We all sprinted back down to the valet hut, checking each other for bugs and laughing it off. The next morning, one of our valets went to retrieve a car parked in spot 156 and found a 12-foot rattlesnake resting underneath it, rattling as he approached. It's illegal to kill them there, so someone had to come and remove it. After that, everyone started to believe the story. Later, our manager confirmed that at least 2 people had, in fact, died by sewage from that tree. Story 15. In San Antonio, there's a story about a school bus that once broke down on a set of train tracks. After getting stuck there, a train came barreling down, and before any of the children could escape, it collided with the bus, tragically killing everyone on board. It was such a devastating event that nearby streets were named after the children who lost their lives. As you drive past a mental institution, you'll find yourself on roads named after those children, and eventually you reach a hill. At the top of this hill, the road meets the train tracks. According to the legend, if you park your car on the tracks and put it into neutral, something strange happens. For an added effect, you can sprinkle white powder on your bumper before the experiment. After a short wait, your car will start to move all by itself, off the tracks. What makes it especially eerie is that your car doesn't roll down the hill. It rolls up the hill. When you check the white powder, you may find small fingerprints left behind. These prints are said to belong to the children who died in that wreck. Their spirits are believed to push your car off the tracks, to save you, just as they couldn't be saved. Story 16. In a quiet rural area in upstate New York, a string of murders occurred that no one was able to solve. Victims were often found in places where they had appeared to be relaxing just moments before their deaths, completely unaware of what was about to happen. One night, a young woman was staying at her mother's summer home. Before bed, she decided to lie down on the couch and watch some TV. She began to doze off, but suddenly opened her eyes and saw a man's face staring at her from just outside the window. She screamed and immediately called 911. Police arrived within minutes to search for the suspect, but they were puzzled by what they found. The window overlooked a lake with an artificial sandy shore, yet there were no footprints. Nothing suggested anyone had stood outside. A few days later, a man was apprehended and interrogated. He was tied to at least a dozen murders, and detectives quickly identified him as a serial killer who targeted victims in their sleep. When asked about the attempted murder involving the young woman, they asked how he escaped without leaving any trace. Already tied to the other crimes, he calmly confessed. He hadn't been outside the window that night. What the young woman saw was not a face outside. It was his reflection, because he was already inside the house, standing behind the couch, waiting for her to fall asleep. Story 17. In Waco, Texas, just outside Cameron Park, there lie the ruins of what locals call the Witch's Castle. The legend goes that back in the 1800s, a woman living there was believed to practice dark magic. She allegedly sacrificed children, black servants, and even people's pets. Rumors swirled that she performed black magic and all sorts of evil rituals. Eventually, the townspeople had enough. They revolted, marching into the woods to the castle, where they locked the woman inside. They then set the structure ablaze and tore it down, burning her alive. As she died, she cursed the people, their descendants, and all of Waco. When my grandparents were young, the ruins were open to the public, but over time, they were closed off and separated from the main park. Even now, though, there are secret paths that lead to it. At the entrance, you'll see an eerie graffiti clown painted on the gate. That's where most people stop, because it's pitch black and seriously creepy. But if you continue along the wooded trail, you'll eventually find the ruins. I've been there myself, and I even urinated on the site. Nothing bad has happened to me yet, I think. One time some friends and I went there and noticed something strange. Just by the clown gate, there was a dead tree. Someone had tied dozens of apples to the limbs using fishing line. Every branch had an apple hanging from it. It was one of the weirdest and creepiest things I've ever seen. Story 18. In my country, when someone gets lost, people say something that roughly translates to being seized by led around. What is this lead around? Oh, nothing major. Just something that makes you walk in circles. Except there are also stories of people who encountered some innocent creature, like a child or a dog, and followed it. Then they got tired, sat down to rest, and woke up the next morning just a step away from falling into water. Seems suspicious, right? Well, I Googled it. Turns out its main goal is drowning unsuspecting travelers. It confuses people mentally so that they begin doing strange, pointless things. They lose their sense of direction and can't perceive their surroundings, which allows this force to lure them to bodies of water. It's said that for some people, it is their fate to drown. Lead Around somehow knows this and will try especially hard to complete that destiny. Some stories even claim it can become violent if it's close to achieving its goal. Story 19. I'm really late to the party, so this will probably get buried. But my home county of LaPorte is pretty much only known for its connection to an infamous serial killer. Belle Gunness, the Black Belle, was a Norwegian immigrant who moved to Chicago. She became known for scamming insurance companies. When her first husband's business failed, she burned it to the ground and collected a hefty insurance payout. Belle clearly saw how easy it was to profit from tragedy, and her twisted mind made the jump from insurance fraud to murder. Her first husband died under mysterious circumstances, and she used his life insurance money to buy a farm in LaPorte. She began placing ads in Chicago newspapers, seeking Norwegian immigrants to come settle down with her. This seemed appealing. After all, new immigrants wanted someone who understood their culture and language. Belle owned land too. Sure, she usually asked for suitors to name her as the beneficiary on their insurance policies and wills, but that seemed like a small price to pay. Many men, Norwegian or not, replied and began corresponding with her. Sadly, they fell for the scam and willingly handed over control of their estates. But once they moved in with Belle, they were never heard from again. Many were unwed, lonely men, so few people noticed their absence. Friends and family probably assumed they were enjoying their new lives and didn't return home. The grisly truth was that Belle murdered them and buried their bodies in the hog pen. The disappearances remained unnoticed until something brought Belle under suspicion: her farmhand, Ray Lamphere. He had helped her with many of the murders and had fallen in love with her. When Belle rejected him, she fired him and convinced a local judge he was mentally unstable, ensuring that if he ever accused her, he wouldn't be believed. Eventually, Lampier decided to get revenge. He trapped Belle's family in their house and set it on fire. Only her newest farmhand escaped the blaze. What followed became etched into local history. Investigators searched the ruins for remains, and around the same time, Astley Helgelian, whose brother Andrew had vanished after corresponding with Belle, arrived in Laporte with suspicions. Investigators made a horrifying discovery on Belle's property. They began digging and found body after body. Most were men who had answered her ads. She had murdered them all, collecting what money she could just to pay her mortgage. Her disregard for human life was staggering. She literally killed men to keep her house. And then it got even darker. A woman's body was found in the burned-down farmhouse, but its measurements didn't match Belle Gunness, even accounting for fire damage. Worse, the body contained lethal levels of poison. This raised suspicions that Belle had used another woman as a body double. Several girls and women had also died on her farm, so she may have used one of them to fake her own death. Many believe she convinced Lampier, possibly using manipulation or intimacy, to burn the house down and help her escape. She knew it was only a matter of time before someone came looking for the men who had disappeared. After the fire, people claimed to have seen someone matching Belle's description in the area for years. The body in the ruins was also missing its head, making identification impossible. A convenient and suspicious detail. To this day, many believe Belle escaped. And here's the part that personally gives me chills. I worked at the county museum for a time. We had a whole section dedicated to Belle, including chilling artifacts from her farm and even a piece of the original shed. Our most prized possession? The skull of Andrew Helgelian. Yes, we had an actual human skull in a display cabinet, and that wasn't the only one. One time I was looking for a TV manual for a video exhibit and stumbled across a skull in a basket, forgotten in a cabinet. At first I thought it was just a Halloween prop, but when I pulled it out, I saw the tag. It was the skull of a Native American, exhumed from a nearby farmstead along with other artifacts. There I was, unknowingly holding the 200-year-old remains of a real person, playing with it like Hamlet. When I told the curator, she just said, "Oh, I thought we lost that. How do you lose a human skull?" Story 20. I'm late to the party, but here goes. So the deal is, I come from a small town in Iceland, about 200 kilometers from the capital, Reykjavik. The town is called Vik, and on each side of the town are vast black sands through which the main road runs. The only way in and the only way out of town is through those sands. The black sands stretch from the sea all the way up to the mountains. Around the 1800s to 1900s, the coastline was a popular fishing spot for French fishermen who mostly fished for cod. It's estimated that around 400 of the boats that fished along the coast ended up stranding. Some of the stranded fishermen survived, but most did not. So a lot of men have died down there over the centuries. There were also passers-by who got lost in the fog or died from the sudden and harsh winter storms that can appear out of nowhere. Shallow valleys still cross the area, remnants of ancient glacial streams, most of which have dried up. There's one particular valley called Dragala, which roughly translates to Ghost Valley. In winter, we only get a few hours of daylight, meaning the nights are long and cold. I've heard from many different sources that people who drive through that valley alone sometimes encounter unwanted hitchhikers, ghostly figures that seem to appear out of thin air in the passenger seat. They don't speak, just stare forward, and then vanish the moment the car crosses out of the valley. I used to drive that route every weekend for 4 years, and luckily, I never saw anything myself. I'm not usually the type to be rattled by urban legends, but this one always got to me. Driving alone through the middle of nowhere, going down into that valley, I would always catch myself speeding way over the limit when I reached the other side, just in case. Story 21. This is a story I heard when I was a child from my grandmother about her relatives who lived in rural China a long time ago. I've never shared this with anyone and had almost forgotten it until now. So thank you, Reddit. This feels like the right place to begin. Back during Chairman Mao's era, everyone was very poor, and resources were scarce. In China, like in many Asian societies, the eldest child carries greater responsibilities, and is expected to look after younger siblings. This one family had constant arguments. The older daughter felt she was being treated unfairly. Any small possession they had was always given to the younger daughter. After each fight, she would run away from home and cry beside a nearby pond. The pond was known for being a place where several people had taken their lives. Locals believed it was haunted. Her parents dismissed her actions as attention-seeking. One night after a particularly bad fight, her parents had given her clothing to her younger sister without asking. She ran out and never came back. In the morning, her body was found in the pond. The clothes she was wearing were neatly folded beside the water. She had cherished the little clothing she had and couldn't bear to let it be ruined. There's an old Chinese belief in shui gui, water ghosts, and ti shen, replacement body. It's the idea that people who drown become lingering spirits. They are not necessarily evil, but they are tormented souls who can't enter the afterlife unless they lure another person to take their place. Until then, they remain trapped, unable to reincarnate. On the night the girl died, a neighbor had passed by and heard her weeping by the pond, talking hysterically to herself. My grandmother always believed the girl didn't really want to take her own life, that she was possessed or coerced by a shui gui desperate for release. She was the last person to drown in that pond. Not long after, the pond was filled in to make room for development. The most chilling part for me was when my grandmother wiped her tears and softly whispered, "Pitiful, so very pitiful." She didn't even have a chance to find her own Tishen. Story 22. My uncle was driving down a rural road in Maharashtra, which is a state in India. He was on his way back from visiting a small piece of farmland he owned, located about 15 miles from any kind of town or settlement. As he drove back toward his hometown, he passed a tiny shack in the middle of nowhere. A few miles after that, he glanced in his rearview mirror and saw an old woman in a white sari sitting in his back seat. Blood was trickling down the side of her face. At this point, my uncle was understandably terrified. The woman suddenly reached forward into the front seat and tried to strangle him. He immediately pulled the car over and jumped out. But when he turned around, there was no sign she had ever been there. He made it home about an hour later, but by then he had developed a fever of 107 degrees Fahrenheit and was in critical condition. After being placed in an ice bath and resting through the night, he finally woke up. That's when his family noticed dark bruises on his neck. Later, they found out that the shack he passed had once been the hideout of a serial criminal, a man who abducted women from nearby villages and assaulted and murdered them there. The woman my uncle saw had reportedly been one of the victims, killed several years earlier. Story 23. I grew up with lots of them. New Orleans is a great place to live for people who love the supernatural. I spent several nights at the Myrtle Plantation as a child, and my mom's family plot is just 3 rows up from Marie Laveau's grave. I've seen some unsettling things. The slave quarters off LA 308 in Lafourche gave me a run for my money during my first year of college at Nichols. Ring the bell, see the lights. But the worst? The Rougarou. One night, my buddy and I were out in Paradise doing some frogging. We had smoked a joint, but the high had already worn off. The boat had died, and we had to use the trawl motor to get to shore before walking about a mile down a dark swamp road to the generator-powered trailer we called camp. We had 2 sacks of frogs, had seen gators and snakes, and stank of marsh water and sweat. Digging around in that swamp mud gives off a foul, earthy stench, like septic methane mixed with rot. But as we walked down the road, we noticed a new smell. It was stronger than the swamp stink, stronger than our clothes, stronger than the cigarettes we were smoking. It was horrific, rancid, a mix of rotting leaves and decaying flesh. Imagine a bag of wet leaves stewing with old beef you forgot about in your fridge. It wasn't unnatural, but it felt wrong, like the land itself was breathing it out. Then this heavy drop hit my gut. My buddy felt it too. Without saying a word, we stomped out our cigarettes and bolted for camp. We heard rustling in the woods just beyond the tree line, following us all the way back. When we got to camp, we jumped in the truck and hit the high beams. Nothing. Not a thing. Then we went to check on the boat and grabbed the spotlight. We shined it into the woods. About a yard back, saplings and brush were all knocked askew. Not destroyed, but definitely disturbed. All the way back to camp, there was a dust cloud still settling, and the trailer's window netting had been torn open. The glass was shattered. That window sits about 7 feet off the ground, easily a foot higher than me. There were claw marks on the dirt below. We were told it was a cougar with mange, but this wasn't a cat. A big cat would have attacked while we ran. We were out of shape and slow. No, this was something else. Something bigger, smarter, and meaner. We never went back to that particular camp again. Story 24. My buddy and I heard about this park in Harbor City with a duck pond. Supposedly, the devil appears there, and people can sell their souls to him. He's said to appear like a normal person, but very well-mannered and sharply dressed. Rumor has it that a rap artist once sold his soul there and became famous. I called nonsense and we decided to check it out. When we got to the park, it was pitch black. No lights, no lamps, and the duck pond was pretty far inside. While walking along the sidewalk looking for the quickest path to the pond, my buddy kept complaining about how bad of an idea it was and how he didn't want to go through with it. I ignored him and kept going. I'll admit the whole place had a creepy vibe, but honestly, I was more worried about getting jumped or mugged than running into anything supernatural. As we walked, things got oddly quiet. I looked behind us. No cars on the street. It felt weird, but I brushed it off as a coincidence and kept walking toward the park. My buddy was still freaking out, ranting about how sketchy it was and how many gangs and homeless people were known to hang around there. Eventually, I got fed up and said, "Okay, forget it. Let's just go back to the car." We started walking back. I was still scanning the park, trying to find an entrance. Then my friend stopped, looked at me and asked, "Did you really want to go in there?" I said yes, that I still did. He paused, then said, "Okay, forget it. Let's go." We turned and headed back toward the park. That's when I felt it, an insane sense of nervousness and a heavy pressure on my chest. I ignored it, thinking it was just nerves. But my friend started complaining of the same thing happening to him. I still thought it was in our heads until the animals started reacting. First, the ducks. They started going off like crazy. It didn't sound like normal quacking, more like distressed shrieks. Then I saw the winding path that led to the pond. As I focused on it, we noticed rats, dozens of them, bolting away from the pond. We looked at each other, totally confused. Then came the skunks, 3 or 4 of them racing toward the street. A couple of opossums jumped out of a tree near us and ran in the same direction. Moments later, birds in the trees started chirping wildly, all around us. It was surreal. I froze, trying to make sense of what was happening. And then I saw it. At the end of the path, there was an archway and a bench. I focused my eyes, and that's when I noticed the ember of a cigarette. It moved, rising and falling, as if someone had just taken a drag. I followed the ember and saw a puff of smoke rise into the air, and then the faint silhouette of a person on the bench. I could make out the outline of his body. My heart started pounding, adrenaline hit, and then came a deep, dark fear. Not just nerves. This was something primal. My body was screaming at me to leave. Every part of me said, "Don't go in there." And yet part of me still wanted to approach, wanted to see who or what it was. I turned to my friend and said, "There's someone there. Devil or not, the guy might be armed or dangerous. I don't want to risk it." He agreed. We turned back toward the car. As we walked away, the animals went silent. The park returned to its eerie stillness. I'll never know for sure what or who that was. Maybe it was just a person, but after what I saw and felt, I'm perfectly fine never finding out. That was enough for me. Take it for what it is. Story 25. There is an urban legend where I live. I live in a rural area that was settled a long time ago. The story goes that in the days of the first settlement, there was one teenage girl who was very into the supernatural and began to experiment with witchcraft. Around the same time, several villagers began to notice that strange things were happening. That year, the harvest was bad, several people fell ill, and a young boy even died. The villagers, overwhelmed by their misfortunes, began discussing possible causes, and eventually it came out that a teenage girl had been experimenting with dark magic. The villagers became enraged and rallied to have her burned at the stake. They asked if she had any last words. She requested that her final words be engraved on her tombstone, and then she recited a long speech. Those exact words were placed on her tombstone. It is said that anyone who reads the inscription out loud at her grave will experience misfortune shortly afterward. And if someone curses her name, it is believed that any nearby church will catch fire. I've actually visited this grave. I don't believe in the supernatural, but I can't explain what happened that night. My friends and I had been telling ghost stories beforehand, so we were all a bit jumpy. We approached the grave close to midnight. There was a horse farm nearby, and we could hear the horses whinnying. The moon was full, so it was surprisingly bright out. We reached the grave, and one of my friends read the tombstone aloud in full. At first, nothing happened. Then we heard an incredibly loud and shockingly close neigh from the horses, followed by the thunder of hooves, much closer than they should have been. I'm not ashamed to say that my friends and I screamed and ran back to the car. I jumped into the front seat while the driver got behind the wheel. The car wouldn't start. In the chaos, two girls jumped into the passenger seat and onto my lap, and everyone was screaming for us to leave. I slammed the door, but I didn't realize one of the girls still had her hand on the outside of the car. I had slammed the door on her hand. Somehow the door had locked even though none of us had locked it. I had to manually unlock it while she screamed in pain, opened the door again, and then finally shut it properly. The car started, the lights came on, we drove away. Fortunately, it was an older car with no metal around the windows, so while it was painful, her hand wasn't broken. I still don't know whether what happened was all in our heads or if something else was going on. But I do know I don't plan on going back to that grave anytime soon. Story 26. When I was a kid, I used to live with my family in Bucharest. One evening, my dad was coming home from work. It was starting to get dark, and his commute usually took 25 to 30 minutes at most. He said he was stopped at a red light for a minute or two. There were no cars or people around, which was strange because the area was usually busy, especially at that hour. Then, in the blink of an eye, as the light turned green, he was no longer in the city. He said he suddenly found himself on an old road in the middle of a field, with black houses visible in the distance. And it wasn't almost dark anymore. It was pitch black, with only the moonlight revealing those eerie houses. He drove forward about 100 meters and suddenly he was back in the city as if nothing had changed. But when he looked at the time, it was now around 10 p.m. What had felt like seconds to him had lasted 3 hours. His phone also had no signal during that time. For years, I thought he was just making it up. But now, every time he tells that story, I can see that it still unsettles him. Story 27. This happened to my grandpa, who was in the military during the 1960s. It was during the time when Pakistan and India were essentially at war, specifically the 1965 Indo-Pakistan War. His regiment was stationed somewhere in the woods, and every day the soldiers were assigned specific tasks. As my grandpa tells it, his task was to collect water or food for the next morning, and he liked doing it at night, enjoying the silence while smoking. One night, he decided to take a different path to the well. He was an experienced outdoorsman, so he didn't think twice about it. While walking, he noticed something crawling ahead of him. He pulled out his gun and hid behind a tree, only to realize it was a baby goat. Thinking it was lost and vulnerable to predators, he decided to carry it back to camp. He lifted it onto his shoulders and began walking. After a while, he started feeling like the goat was getting heavier. At first, he thought it was just fatigue, but then it got worse. His back began to ache, and the weight felt unnatural. He turned his head and saw that the goat's legs had grown longer, long enough to almost touch the ground. Terrified, he dropped the goat. It immediately started laughing and screaming in a human voice, repeating, "It was fun! It was fun!" He ran back to camp as fast as he could. The next day, he fell seriously ill, sick with fever and chills to the point where he had to be moved to the medical unit. Story 28. My dad told me this story one night while we were driving home. He used to coach the girls' soccer team at the high school where he teaches, and he once told this same story on the bus ride back from a game. He said it had some of the players crying with fear. When he was a senior in high school, he went to a school dance or some event like that. He stayed afterward to help clean up and was one of the last to leave. This was back in New York, and it was snowing pretty heavily. His family wasn't well off, and since he lived fairly close to the school, he always walked home. As he was walking across a field on his way back, he noticed a man walking in the same direction. At first, he didn't think much of it, just assumed it was someone heading the same way. But it was around 1 a.m., and everything was dead silent. Eventually, they both ended up on the same road, and that's when my dad started to feel uneasy. He usually took a small pathway through the woods to get home, and he started heading that way. But the man followed. That part of the area was always deserted, especially that late at night. The guy even smiled at him at some point, and my dad said that was when he decided to run. But here's the strange part. The man didn't run after him. He just kept walking. And no matter how fast my dad ran, and he was in good shape, he rode his bike everywhere. The guy never lost ground. He just stayed the same distance behind, walking the entire time. When my dad reached the field near the elementary school that he cut across to reach his street, the man was still following, still smiling. He never broke into a run, never sped up, just continued walking with that same eerie grin. When my dad reached his house, he remembered he had to enter through the back door because the front door was blocked with trash. His family struggled financially, and his mom was neurotic and never cleaned, so the back door was their only option. He had to jump the fence, and his shirt got stuck on it for a few seconds. Meanwhile, he could hear the man opening the gate and coming into the backyard. He fumbled with the broken lock. It required reaching in and fiddling with it to open the door. The man was about 7 or 8 feet away at this point. My dad saw a flash of metal in the man's hand. The smile was even wider. Just in time, my dad got the door open, slammed it shut, locked it, and ran upstairs. He stayed awake for hours. The next morning, still shaken, he questioned whether the whole thing had been a dream. The idea of a man keeping up with him on foot while walking seemed absurd. But then he went outside and checked the fence in the backyard. The man's footprints were still there. Story 29. This is one that I still need to finish writing based on a story a friend told me. Let me start by saying that the details are a little limited for now. I'll try to follow up later and clarify. It was her friend's brother who experienced this. Yeah, I know. It's one of those friend of a friend stories, which usually means it's fake. But either way, let me tell you about Callus. So the guy who originally experienced this, let's call him Eric, is into film. He and 2 of his buddies were taking a summer road trip filming ghost towns, maybe for a project or just for fun. At some point, they got lost trying to reach a particular ghost town and stumbled upon a sign referencing a place called Calic. Probably not the exact spelling. I really need to check that. The town wasn't on any modern maps and only showed up on some old signposts. The road leading to it looked abandoned and forgotten. Naturally, they figured it would make for perfect footage. What better ghost town to film than one that barely exists? They drove into Calic and immediately noticed something was off. They had already visited several ghost towns before, but this one felt different. It wasn't that it was preserved or well-maintained. There was just something strange about it. It didn't seem as old or decayed as the others. Yet not a soul was in sight, just buildings, wind, and silence. While driving through, they passed a house that had a statue of a man in the front yard. It wasn't labeled and had clothing that looked oddly modern. Eric glanced at it but didn't think much of it at the time. However, as they drove past, he got a strange feeling and looked back. He swears the statue turned its head and watched the car leave. Still, he shook it off. Just a statue, right? Eventually, they reached the far end of town where there was a large farmhouse and an enormous barn. It struck them as odd. There was no sign of livestock or fields nearby. Curious, they decided to take a look inside. The barn was empty except for one thing, a small white box in the middle of the floor. It looked pristine and totally out of place. It was the kind of box you'd expect at a kid's birthday party, way too clean to belong there. They didn't stay long. The place gave them a deeply uncomfortable feeling, like they were intruding. When they stepped out of the barn, the entire town seemed to come alive. People were exiting the houses and slowly walking toward the barn, forming a line as they moved. The 3 guys panicked, jumped into their car, and drove around the outskirts of town to avoid passing through the crowd. The car took some damage, but they made it out. Eventually, they stopped at a gas station belonging to a national chain and went inside. They told the clerk what had happened and asked if he knew anything about a nearby town called Calix. The man's entire demeanor changed. He became visibly disturbed and refused to answer any questions. He only said it would be best if they left and never looked for Calic again. Later on, one of them decided to search online for more about Calic. Still, they couldn't find anything official. The only mention they uncovered was on a bizarre old website, like something from the early days of the internet, that was documenting activity of alleged remaining members of the Manson family.